here with everyone today. I know that the holiday season is especially busy, so I'll do my best to make the best use of your time and give you a lot of great information today. The focus of this webinar is going to be tools to meet your customer needs and to understand exactly what your patients want. Now, there's a lot of ways that we could talk about experience management. It's a big, important topic. But one of the foundations is understanding what your patients want and need in the first place. And so today we're going to talk about exactly how you can do that. So before we get started on the information, I just want to tell you a little bit about us to put my comments into context. So I lead our experience management practice at Gelb. We've been around for a long time, in fact, over 50 years, and we have a lot of experience in healthcare, particularly experience management. So you can see here some of the numbers on the slide with other clients that we work with. So we do work with clients in behavioral health as well. Some of our recent examples are Menninger Clinic and Cencor. But we also work with hospitals and academic medical centers to help improve experiences of patients and build programs. And so I also want to note that as we go through today, I know that behavioral health, we refer to customers somewhat differently. Sometimes clients, sometimes patients. Of course, there's families and parents to consider. So for simplicity's sake, today I'll just refer to them as patients, but know that when I do that, this would really be all-encompassing for families, parents, caregivers, and really anyone who's an important part of their journey. So what we're going to do today is we will be talking about a wide variety of topics, first starting off with a little bit information about experience management itself. Now, I know that we have attendees with a variety of backgrounds. Some of you might have worked on experience initiatives before and you really have a good understanding of this. And for others, this might be brand new. So that's why we're going to start off with just a quick overview of experience management, why it's important, and also how it's unique in behavioral health. And then we'll move on to the heart, which is really understanding those tools that you can use to get to the patient's needs and to understand what their experience is like. And then finally, we'll touch on how to use that information to make an impact on your organization. So starting off with some basics of the patient experience. So that's a pretty, broad term. What does it mean in the first place? Well, first off, it's important to know that when we think about the patient experience, we're not just referring to what happens during a treatment or during a therapy session, but actually it starts way before and extends way after that. The continuum of care for patients that you serve is really all-encompassing. They have belief and expectations even before they meet you or receive services. And so for better or worse, all parts of the experience have to be considered and understood as you go through this process. And if everyone can just take a few seconds and think about a time when you were a patient at a hospital or even have had a close friend or family member, think about how your perspective changed when you were on the other side. What parts of your experience met your expectations versus what part went surprisingly well? So, for example, a doctor who went out of their way to make sure you had what you needed. Or the opposite of it, what parts of your experience were really frustrating? Disney actually has a term for this. They call this putting themselves in the shoes of patients or their customers for Disney's sake, and it's called customer centrism. And this is something that they do regularly, is the idea of putting themselves in their customers' shoes and really figuring out how they can manage each experience so that their customers are highly satisfied. The other thing to consider is that there are different types of needs. So oftentimes we think a lot about functional needs. So it's very easy to think about what we do, what services we offer, and what are our clinical outcomes. Those are all functional needs. We monitor them because they're really easy to track, and they're really, what we think about on a regular basis. But even though these are important, they're actually not what drives patients oftentimes to recommend us or to be overly satisfied with their experience. When we think about what stories patients tell others, sometimes they do include functional needs, how well their functional needs were met, but a lot of times it's really about how they feel and those emotional needs. So even, for example, talking to patients about the background of why you're doing what you're doing. One of the common things that we hear on surveys is assessing safety. So yes, patients want to know that they're safe, but how do they know that they're safe? So some of the strategies that, for example, we've worked with clients on is helping patients to understand what's happening in the background. So I am moving this equipment for your safety, or I am doing this for your safety. And then it helps to meet those emotional needs. So they can say, okay, my needs are well met. They're really thinking about me and what I'm doing. And so when we think about needs, it's really, both of these have to come into play, and both of these are really important. And where we most often, like I said, where we most often tend to not think about are the emotional part of it. So why does experience matter? Now, there's a lot of reasons why experience matters. We could probably have a whole webinar on this, but a lot of research does show that patients are more compliant and outcomes are better when they're happy with their experience. And you can probably even just think of examples of this from your everyday life and your professional work. The other thing is how teams are impacted. So it's really easy for us to get caught up in the everyday and forget why we're in this line of work or why we do what we do. But at the same time, having that focus on the patient experience and sharing patient stories and patient examples really helps to get to a better place of morale and remembering why we do what we do. Now, if you're in leadership or if you deal with the finance part of it, you know that patient experience is also a part of healthcare reform. It aligns with other objectives. For example, trauma-informed care is one of them. We hear a lot about trauma-informed care and how organizations are trying to incorporate it into their everyday practices. Now, there's a lot of descriptions about what it means to be trauma-informed, but really what it comes down to is being able to meet patients where they're at and to understand how we can best meet their needs rather than just following our usual process. Now, of course, most patients have no idea what trauma-informed means, but they do know what's important to them. And they do know, what they want and what they need to have a better experience. And so being able to incorporate their voice and incorporate the needs of their experience is really critical. The other piece that I want to hit on just a little bit is the idea of consumerism. So as I mentioned, we do this research all the time, and this is a theme that we've been hearing over and over again. In the past, experience management has honestly been a little bit easier in healthcare. Patients receive treatment that we as professionals think is best, and we really don't measure satisfaction a lot, or if we do, it's not critical to business objectives. But today's different. Today's patients have a much louder voice. They have many more choices. Think about how easy it is for patients to amplify their voice for social media, to talk about their experiences in chat rooms, to compare us to other organizations. And the other interesting thing is that they're not just comparing healthcare providers to each other, but they're also actually comparing us to other organizations. Now, obviously, Starbucks and Amazon is much different than healthcare, but I do want to bring this up to challenge you to expand your thinking outside of the box, because there are things that we can do to learn from some of these other organizations to help improve patient experiences. For example, Starbucks does a really great job with employee empowerment, with their loyalty programs, with consistent quality across locations. And then you have Amazon, where it's very easy to compare products. They have subscription-based services. They have near-time value delivery. Other organizations we tend to hear a lot about: Disney, Trader Joe's, Chick-fil-A. So there's a lot of examples of organizations that are really considered to do a good job with customer service that even in healthcare we can learn about. So a few things I want to point out are some current trends that we see in our research and that we've been seeing pretty consistently recently. So what causes patients to want to be loyal to a provider or to talk about the experiences that they liked versus what causes them to complain? Here are some things that are coming out is really important pretty consistently, no matter what market they're in, no matter what service, no matter what area of healthcare. And that's first off that they demand respect for their time. So they're less and less willing to wait. They're less willing to, be understanding when on a consistent basis they're waiting in the office or they're coming for their scheduled appointment and they're not seeing their provider for a while. Another big thing is cost and insurance. And especially with behavioral health, this is a huge frustration because they're not sure what's covered, what the insurance is going to pay for, how much they're going to pay. And so having transparency up front and being able to make a decision about what they can pay is really important to them. Another thing is that they seek a personalized experience. So they're not satisfied coming and seeing a new provider every time and having to repeat their story or repeat, something that was important to them. They expect that their preferences are going to be remembered. Things like, last time we talked, you told me you were going on vacation. How was that vacation? These are the types of things they expect. And along those lines, there's the use of technology. So of course, with technology and EMR and, records, some of those preferences can be remembered and some of those things can be made a little bit easier. But they also want to use technology themselves for convenience and control. For example, they can get on a portal at 10 o'clock at night after they put their kids to bed and schedule an appointment. So these are some of the things that we're seeing trends is what they really want and are beginning to expect. For a while, having things like online portals were a happy surprise that they weren't expecting. But today, it's starting to become more of an expectation. Now, there are some things that don't change. So one of the things that doesn't change is the fact that what's the top driver of satisfaction is they want a long-term trusted provider and they want care continuity. So that's something that, hasn't changed over the past years and we don't expect to change. A few unique challenges to behavioral health. So every service line or type of healthcare has some type of unique challenges. And behavioral health, we know that there's a high need for services, but increasingly shortages in care and capacity. Just for example, in my local community, the need for services continues to increase, but changes in reimbursement and budget cuts are requiring a lot of the behavioral health organizations to either stop hiring or even have layoffs. So having high caseloads and not enough staff is a big challenge that makes it difficult to provide an ideal experience. So we definitely have to recognize that in many situations, delivering an ideal experience is not necessarily the result of a provider who's not doing a good job, but also that systems and processes aren't necessarily supporting it. So there's kind of the big context to think about. Another unique thing is in behavioral health, decisions are often made in a crisis. There's not a lot of time to prepare or research or think through a decision. Treatment journeys are oftentimes long. There's not always a clear ending. And depending on the type of specific situation, patients or their families aren't always able to advocate for themselves or to tell us when things are not working. So there's no perfect answer to those challenges, but there are some things that can help. And so keeping that in mind, we're going to move to the next section, which is talking about the specific tools that you can use to understand what your patients want and need. So I want to start with a little bit of foundational kind of information before we get into the tools. There are a few things that really need to be accounted for when you start on this type of process. First off, it's important to consider all the parts of the experience. There's definitely a mentality that we're always trying to overcome, which is the idea of that's not my area, that's someone else's problem. And really, that's very, very damaging to the patient experience. So with experience management, we're trying to think of a framework that is going to overcome that and get us out of our siloed thinking. The other thing that we're going to consider is a variety of touch points. So there's a lot of ways that patients interact with us, from facilities to phone call to digital to actually face-to-face interpersonal. And so it's really important to think about each of these when we think about the experience. So I want to show you an example of ways that we use with our clients to examine needs, and that's experience map. Sometimes people call them journey maps. They might look different or have different activities on them, but the goal is the same. And that's really to understand the experiences at all stages. So we typically start with need, which recognizes what happens even before the patient needs care and the process of how they decide where to receive that care. So for example, in behavioral health, one of the things that we talk about is how it's really important for providers to be top of mind and easy to access, because when a crisis arises, there isn't a lot of time, there isn't a lot of research, and it's something that needs to be very easily accessible. So it's really important to use a map like this that really touches on each stage of the journey. And what we do then as we go through the next stages of getting feedback from patients is actually walk them through each stage of their journey. The other thing that's important is thinking about touch points and experience stewards. So I gave some examples before, but touch points are how someone interacts with you. And these are some things that during each stage of the journey, they're going to interact with you in different ways. And some things are going to work better than the other. So for example, they might have great experience when they meet with somebody in person and meet with their care provider, but they have a horrible experience when they try to call and get a hold of someone on the phone. So these distinctions through each stage of the journey are really important. The other part here to think about is the different nuances of each step. So this here is an example of a completed experience map. We would use this in a couple of ways. First, we would examine the experience and talk to patients through each stage. So you can see here some of the key activities. So each of these key activities would have a question area that we would focus on. The other thing that we would do is we would use this for action planning to make decisions and talk internally about how each part of the experience is going to be impacted by decisions or by changes. And as you start going through and using some type of experience framework like this, you start to get to the more details and really get insight as to what each activity entails. So for example, here is getting an appointment. This is, an example in which the clients identified 3 different ways that patients are using to get an appointment and how the experience stewards impact each one. And so within this, they would be able to look at which areas are high performing and which areas need improvement. So I want to switch now now that we have the basic framework down for how to use a journey map or an experience map to identify needs. I'd like to give you some practical tools to get feedback. Now, I think in all of our years of doing this, one thing I can say is that a common theme is that direct feedback is always the best. We've had a lot of clients who've done research with patients to make improvement in certain areas. And then they said, okay, we've done this. We think we know what they want. Let's go to a different program and just go based off of our assumptions. And they found drastically different results from doing that. And what they find is that when they make assumptions, they always get some things right, but they miss other really big things. And so really being able to share with your teams direct stories, quotes, data, even audio clips, it's really important to get that direct feedback if you can. The other thing I would add is just being able to invoke empathy. Sometimes you might, as a direct care provider, you might see what patients and their families go through every day, but others don't necessarily get it. And so playing short audio clips or having those direct quotes are really critical for building momentum for change. So here's an overview of a variety of tools that you can use to get feedback from patients. Now, the lower cost tools on the bottom are going to be things that can be used on a more everyday basis, whereas the higher cost would be used on a more situational basis, and also for those who have more of a role in managing budgets and being able to take on the bigger initiatives. But at the same time, no matter what your role and what your budget, there are still things to do. So first off, observational. This has to do with simply observing what's happening. From a low-cost level, volunteering was really a way to see what's happening directly and to see where opportunities for improvement exist. You can hear what patients and their families are asking or saying and see what they're experiencing. So, for example, in an inpatient setting, a common tactic is that executives spend a certain number of hours per week visiting patients' room and asking how things are going and asking them for feedback. If you're doing at-home therapy, it's having people go with therapists to the appointment to observe what's happening. Chair exercise is oftentimes used when most of the services are received at a facility or hospital. And this is literally just sitting in each chair and observing what happens. So you go to the check-in area where patients are waiting and you sit and you watch and you observe. And then you go to the next area, whether it's a treatment area or a cafeteria or a group area. Whatever it is, it's simply observing what's happening. Patient journaling and flip cams are ways that you can get patients involved. So you can ask patients to document what they see or to use a flip cam to observe what they're going through. And actually some hospitals are starting to use flip cams as a budget-friendly way to share videos of what to expect as a patient. A lot of times patients say, I don't want to just see a marketing, beautiful video of all the great stuff. I want to see what really happens. What am I really going to see as a patient? And these flip cams are a pretty cool way to do that. The second thing here is co-creation. And this is really when you work with other team members or patients to create ideas for change. So with persona development or storyboarding, you're working with other team members, ideally from different areas of the journey. So for example, you would have somebody from scheduling, somebody from treatment, somebody from technology, different cross-functional areas to discuss what you've seen and done and the feedback that you've gotten, and to outline things that need to be changed. Another great tactic is including customers or experts in that process. So you can have actual patients who agree to sit in with you on these sessions and agree to be part of an advisory board that meets regularly to talk about these things. The other technique is engagement, and this is where we work most frequently at GELB. So this is probably where the majority of our projects lie in this section. And this involves direct feedback through research. So focus groups, online surveys, in-depth interviews. For experience mapping, we typically use in-depth interviews because it gives us a lot of breadth and depth of information. In that situation, each interview takes about an hour. And the reason that it falls on the higher cost side is that it is very time consuming to conduct in-depth interviews. You know, like I said, each of them takes about an hour. So if you're going to interview 40 patients, that's a lot of hours that you're putting into these interviews. And the other thing is, not always, but oftentimes we do provide an incentive because we are asking for quite a bit of the patient's time. So definitely the cost varies based on your resources. You could definitely have someone internally do interviews, and that would, of course, lower the cost a bit. But, definitely with engagement, the great thing here is that you're getting a lot of good information from your patients directly, and a lot of that good, deep feedback on what's working and what's not. Now, the last section here is monitoring. So monitoring is really important to keep up with how things are progressing. So it's not realistic to conduct direct research continually. So monitoring tools allow you to see where you need to focus on improvements and how progress is being made. One of the most helpful ways to do this is just the regular feedback surveys. And this is something that you could even do internally. One of the things that we often put into place is a dashboard that allows everyone to see the results of these surveys very easily, so that they can see exactly what is going on in terms of things patients are rating highly versus things that they're rating low. For example, some of our clients, we can even implement short feedback surveys that would be sent at certain stages of the journey. So you can make it to where after your patients have a first visit or a first, assessment, they could be sent a quick feedback survey of how are things going. And this would not be an in-depth 20-question survey. This is more 3 to 4 questions, very short and simple, and you get it by email. And then you can create workflows to where if they rate you low and they rate something as frustrating, it can actually be escalated to someone internally, whoever you designate, to resolve the issue. So the cool thing about that is before they even get to the next stage of their journey, they're able to have their problem resolved. Before it even gets to the level of a complaint, you're able to know what's going on. Now, if you are in a role where you would have the ability to incorporate something like that, you can also get great information through things like regular team huddles. Now, of course, you probably meet with your team regularly, but what you might not do is add patient experience to the agenda. So this is a very quick, what are you hearing from your patients? What feedback are you getting? What have you seen? What's frustrating to them? And making this a very specific part of the agenda is a really great, low-cost, easy way to get that feedback. So now that I've given you a summary, I want to talk a little bit more detail about some of these tools. I've already talked a little bit about experience mapping. Now, although we conduct a lot of different types of research with our clients, this is probably the most common tool that we use with those in-depth interviews. It's a great foundational tool to start with, or even if you're seeing in your surveys that certain areas are low and patients are rating, for example, in their survey, they might be rating admissions low and you have no idea why or exactly what is causing them to rate it that way. This is a really good way to get some of that in-depth information where they can tell their stories. The other thing is that it is one-on-one. So sometimes focus groups depending on the specific topic, aren't private enough, and it's hard to get that information that they don't want to share with other people. So a few other tools here, I already talked about these, but these are just some examples. So on the bottom left here, you can see this is an example of a flip cam video. This is one of our clients actually. It was MD Anderson, their proton therapy center. They're using a low-cost video where they give patients flip cams and try to understand the experience in a really authentic way from their patient's viewpoint. And then they are actually able to post these on the website with the patient's permission. The other examples here are dashboards that are highly visible, and you don't necessarily have to have a system where everyone has access to your dashboards if you don't want to do that. The other thing that you can do is create big posters and post them in areas that are common where staff are often congregate. So this is an example of a poster that our clients use to post progress, and these are specifically have patient experience areas incorporated into that. And then the camera and chair exercise. So these are pictures that were taken as some of the team members went through that exercise. The other examples here, comment wall. Usually you wouldn't want this somewhere public where your patients would be. This would be more of an internal team comment wall. And the other thing is just making the point to email, to share patient stories or comments. Now, this might seem like the most basic thing, the most low-cost thing you could do, but at the same time, it really is important of acknowledging, good stories and things that went well, and especially if there are certain staff members who are doing a great job. It also reinforces the fact that patient experience is important. We care what our patients think and feel. Now, I won't spend a ton of time on this, but I do just want to give you some tips because we get a lot of questions about the logistics of if we were, going to do one of the more formal research projects where we actually do focus groups or a survey or in-depth interviews. How do we make that happen? So I want to just give you a few tips. First off, when it comes to who is participating in your research, what's really most important here is that you are representing a wide variety of patients, those with different experiences and different backgrounds. So what doesn't work is to say, okay, I want everyone from my team to give me your favorite family that we want to participate. Well, they're probably going to give you the family that is happy and that tells them how great they are and that everything is going well for. And that's great to hear, but that really doesn't give us what we need, which is a variety of experiences. So you really want to think about that going into it. The other thing to think about is demographics. Very commonly now we've had a lot of clients come and say, we only want to talk to patients with a certain type of insurance because we want to understand what they want differently or what they experience differently in terms of payment and billing, certain ages, certain different family backgrounds. So these are important to think about as you go into your research. The other things to think about are other people who you might want feedback from. Other care providers, families of clients, even others internally. So what might be some cultural internal barriers that are preventing them from providing a good experience? So in fact, actually, about half of the work we do today is assessing the experience of those who refer into programs of other care providers. And the reason for this is that as value-based healthcare has more and more of a strong influence, it's critical to be able to coordinate care and to collaborate across organizations. And so talking to these other care providers is really important to understand how are we collaborating across organizations. And of course, it's a really critical influencer for patients as well. When patients come in and say things like, yeah, we can't, my care providers don't share records. They're repeating, doing the same thing over and strong process for collaborating together. So one of the things that we find clients often underestimate is the time and the resources required to recruit for research, especially if it's going to require a lot of time from the participant. So for example, if they have to come to a focus group facility or do an in-depth interview, we oftentimes provide an incentive, as I said before. We don't always do this, but we oftentimes do. For patients, it tends to be around $50. The other thing to consider is that there are, organizations that specialize just in recruiting. So you can kind of tell them what you're doing, give them this script, and they'll do the recruiting for you. So we do oftentimes recommend this to clients or kind of do this process for them because it is something that can be time consuming. And sometimes it's where clients get tripped up. So they have these great, visions of doing all this research, and then they say, oh, I don't have time to plan for it. It takes more planning than I expected. This isn't as quick as I expected. So this is just something to think about in advance to prepare how to, actually make sure to get it done. The other part here is actually preparing your questions. So like we talked about before with the experience map, you want to make sure that your questions are covering all stages of the journey. So you're asking very specific questions like, what happened when you called to schedule your first appointment? Who did you talk to? How did you get in touch with them? But then you're also asking very high level questions. So, for example, at the end, out of everything we've talked about, what is the biggest thing that you would change to improve the experience for our patients? So asking a variety of those types of questions that cover both very specific things and very high level things. The other thing is to consider other initiatives. So for example here, you can see at the top a question that is in a survey for trauma-informed care. And this would be a very specific question that patients would answer. Well, we often encounter clients who come to us and say, we're giving patients these surveys and we're getting low scores and we don't really understand why or what to do about it. And so you can actually take that question and transform it to an in-depth, open-ended question so that during this type of questioning, you can actually understand why are they feeling this way? What's the story behind it? What can we do to improve it? And so that's a really good way to just think about other things that you might be considering. Another thing that our clients often do is they'll give us concepts that they're testing out. So for example, they'll say, we think that it would be really great for our clients to be able to schedule their appointments online, but we're trying to figure out if we should put the time and resources into it. So let's find out how important it is to them. Let's find out what they think about it. So there are very specific things that you can also add into the questioning for that reason. So obviously the main thing here is going to be actually conducting the research. Now, we typically recommend that the person asking the questions is not employed by your organization, or if they are, they're very far removed from patient care. One of the things that we get a lot are patients who worry that bad feedback is going to impact the services that they received. They'll tell us things like, are you going to tell my doctor, or is my therapist going to hear this? And they get really worried about that. So it's really important that you're able to promise that it's going to be anonymous, that you won't link their feedback specifically with them. And also to just keep it conversational, because when it's conversational, they're a lot more likely to share their stories and examples. Really the whole point of in-depth interviewing and qualitative research is being able to get that depth and ask probes and be non-threatening so that they want to share their stories with you. And also being able to document that conversation. So some people like to take notes or audio record it and type later. Sometimes people as interviewers will bring their computers and type as the person talks. That's okay as long as you can do it without being distracting. But regardless of how you document it, it's important to document the details. So we always tell people, we don't want to just know if the patient was happy, because we could get that from an online survey. What we want to know is why they were happy. Give us an example. What happened? Who did you talk to? And it's really important to document all of those things. Now, the last stage that I want to touch on here is how to translate the information that you learn into action. Now, this could be an entire webinar in itself. So we're not going to hit on everything, but I do want to just give you a few tips, things that we use and things that we found helpful. So you've done your research, you've learned a lot about your patients, you have some ideas. So where do you go from here and what do you do? So the first part here is going to be that you want to really try to get insight from each stage of the experience. So again, it's the holistic journey. Where are the breakdowns? Where are the patients going from this is great to this is horrible to I will recommend you to I would definitely not recommend you? Or, are there very little breakdowns at all and it's more very specific things that need to be fixed? So regardless, touching on all of that is important. Sometimes the care teams we work with, they're nervous that we're going to come back to them and just give them a whole list of things they're doing wrong. But like we talked about at the beginning, this is really also a great motivator to remember why we're doing what we're doing. The positive stories are just as helpful as the opportunities for improvement. A lot of times, like I mentioned, we shared audio clips, and we'll have patients who are in tears telling us how their life was changed. And we'll literally have the care team in tears too, because they thought, gosh, I almost forgot why I got into this. And I almost forgot exactly, on an everyday basis, like what's most important to me as I talk to my patients, and how does this impact them. So definitely the more that you can include for detail, quotes, if you're not doing audio recording, use direct quotes, share stories. All of those things are really important for building momentum for change. Here, these screenshots are an example of what we would provide for each stage of the journey. And you can see a lot of green, yellow, red. And the point of this is that we're contrasting the things that work well versus the things that don't work well. So it's not that, every stage, everything works horribly. It's that there are certain things that need to be fixed above others. The other thing, as I said, is just including as much as possible direct quotes. So these are some direct quotes that we've had from some of our projects. Sometimes we have audio clips to play along with these, sometimes they don't. But again, the important thing is really having this to build momentum for change. So I haven't talked a lot about segments up until this point, but I did mention earlier a little bit that you need to think about the demographics of who you're going to talk to when you do any type of interviews or look into any type of patient research. And again, even if this is just a team huddle or something that's a lot more everyday than doing formal research, there still are going to be differences among groups of patients. And so this could be the type of treatment that they're receiving. It could be differences between inpatients or outpatients. And so what's important is to make sure that you identify what these groups are and acknowledge the differences. And so, here you can see a couple examples that we've had from some of our research and some of our reports, things that we've found. But when we went into this, the client would tell us, we're not really sure what the differences are or if there are any notable differences at all. But these are things to really think about as you go through. And again, like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be a big survey that you're doing. These can be things that you talk about just in everyday conversation with how your patients are responding and how they're telling you that things need to be changed. The other thing here, now we're almost done with the webinar, but just a few quick things for how to work with larger groups. Now, again, some of you might have a role where you're in charge of working with larger groups on a regular basis. Some of you don't, and you might just have your work team that you're working with. But regardless, there are some tips that you can use for action planning and for taking this to the next level. So one of the things that we found to be really helpful and we've had great success with is workshops where everyone gets together to brainstorm. Now, what's most important in our workshop is that the role of a doctor or a leader is not more important than the role of the person answering the phone or the person scheduling. Everyone is equal important. Everyone has an ability to brainstorm and is encouraged to brainstorm ideas and to share their opinions. So cross-functional groups are really important here because, again, we're trying to hit on each stage of the experience. The other thing is that sometimes it can be difficult and overwhelming to think about all the changes we want to make. And man, our patients told us so much information. We have a huge list of things we want to do. How can we do it all? And how do we prioritize? So one of the things that can be really helpful is first off to identify what are your quick hits versus what are your long-term goals. So there might be certain things that you can do today or tomorrow. We've been in workshops before commonly where somebody says, I have no idea what to tell patients when they ask this question. And then somebody in the workshop says, I know, I have a full, thing that can give you a great answer for them. Okay, share it with me. We're done. Check that off the list. That was really easy. Let's share it, make sure everybody has it, and let's move forward. There are other things that are going to be a lot more long-term. And so another way that you can work with your team, and again, you can do this in the workshop as part of it, is really assessing what you see as the impact versus the effort. So what's worth it? What is worth it for you to put your time and your resources in terms of what's really going to affect the patient experience and what's going to bring them from, somewhat satisfied to the next level where they're actually going to recommend you and share stories about you. And of course, just making sure that during the actual meeting, you assign responsibilities and timelines. We've all been part of the meetings where everyone talks a lot and then leaves and nothing gets done. So during these types of workshops, we typically do assign specific responsibilities and follow up on that and make sure things are happening. So here's just an example of a workshop that we did where there's several identified needs. Just one of the identified needs is de-escalating upset patients and families. And there are 3 big categories that the work teams came up with. And what's important here is that we're not coming in as an outside company and saying, we know all the best practices and we know what's best. Here's what you should do. It's actually a process where the work teams say, this is what we need to do, and this is what we can do, and this is what we will do. And after this, they go to specifics of, okay, we have these goals. How are we specifically going to make this happen? So definitely, it's really helpful to have these teams work together to come up with that. So, and just here's kind of a last example here of how to debrief with the team. So what did you learn? What are you going to do to take back to your work team? And these things are really important because it is taking it from, okay, I just told you information about what our patients are experiencing. What are we going to do with it? So the last slide here is how do we make it stick? So we definitely don't want it to be like a New Year's resolution where the end of January we forget about it. And the truth is that, you know, if you do put a lot of resources behind research and figuring out what your patients need, and then it just doesn't get talked about anymore 2 months later, that's a huge waste of resources and time. What's really important is incorporating it into your everyday practices and everyday decisions. So one of the things that a lot of our clients have done that is actually really helpful is they filled out their journey map, the one that I showed you at the beginning, with what are the things that are going well, what are the things we need to improve. And they print it out and they actually have it with them at meetings. And they have it with them when they make decisions. And the other helpful thing is it really makes them remember, you know, we have to think about not just our department, but the whole experience. So perhaps we're changing some type of requirement for patients. Well, we think we have it covered for our department, but what about the other steps of the journey? What about how it's going to impact scheduling? What about how it's going to impact the follow-up experience? And so it really is important to keep the journey map top of mind. And also just giving ownership to the care teams. A lot of places have actually started to build in patient experience into accountability, into, you know, bonuses, and into times where they're actually having supervision and determining how well they've done with patient experience. Tying in operations. So, you know, one of the common challenges that we hear are, you know, we want to market how great we are and how quick you can get an appointment or how we do this and that. But the truth is that no amount of marketing is going to fix a broken process. And in the end, patients get more angry because you promise them something you can't deliver. So when it comes to patient experience, you have to tie in operations. There are certain patient experience that no amount of scripting is going to fix. No amount of explaining is going to fix. Now, sometimes it does. Sometimes, you know, maybe I can explain something earlier in the process and give patients a clear roadmap of what to expect, and it fixes it, or at least makes it better. Sometimes it doesn't. So tying in operations is really critical. And then the last thing is setting clear goals, measuring change and progress. So the example that I have for those dashboard posters, monitoring surveys, and even if you don't do this in your organization and you say, that's great, but we don't have the technology, we can't do that, the least you could do is include patient stories, comments, you know, more of the anecdotal things, the comment board where you share what you've experienced. Find a way to keep this front and center. If it just stays in a report or stays in a document or stays in a meeting, it's very likely that you're not going to get a lot of traction on it. It has to be visible and it has to be something that you do regularly. So with that, we're going to open it up to questions and answers. And Shruti, I'll hand it back over to you for that part.
All right. Thank you, Nicole. That was a great session. Moving on to the question and answer session, just as a reminder for everyone attending this session, please use the chat box to send your questions. Nicole, we'll wait for a few minutes so that people can send in their questions. And if not, then we will proceed to this next section of this webinar. Okay. Okay, till the time we are receiving, one second, I think I, okay, like it's general questions from Garcia. She's like grateful for this presentation, and she's like uh, thanking you for this great presentation, Nicole.
Okay.
Okay, and she's asking, will be access to the PowerPoint? So, like after this webinar, we'll share the PowerPoint with everyone. So, if you allow us, we can share the presentation in a non-editable format. Okay, we have received a question from uh, JC Coy. He want to ask, how would this work in rural communities? Any tips?
Yeah, so rural communities, we've definitely done research in communities like that. One of the things that we'll say is that you have to be really careful about the demographics. So this isn't always the case, but a lot of times the case, what we have found is that in rural communities it is a little bit harder to access them online or through, certain types of research. And so a lot of times we'll move away from online surveys in that situation and move towards the more in-depth research. Sometimes, depending on the situation, it even becomes more important to meet with them in person, to talk with them, even though even though you might be able to access them by phone, sometimes they don't just respond as well that way. A lot of it does depend on the age, but I would definitely say that all of these things that we talked about are just as important in rural communities. And actually, one of the things that we've noticed is that they tend to be even a little bit more behind on patient experience than others. Some of the ways, particularly with how they use technology, with the tools that are available to patients, and also with the options that patients have are more limited. We tend to hear more things with they need help related to transportation and to, managing things that just being from a rural community are a little bit harder. They also have and behavioral health especially tend to have a higher concerns about privacy and the stigma and how they can make sure that their privacy is maintained. As if anyone's from a small town, you know how that is. So we've definitely heard a lot about that. But yeah, so those are just a few things, but rural communities are definitely, all of this is something that is very applicable.
All right, thank you. There is a comment from Alicia. She's thankful to you for this presentation. She said, I'm currently working on my internal brand presentation, and this information was very helpful. Thank you, Nicole, for sharing. Have a great rest of your week and Christmas holidays.
Great. Well, thank you. Same to you.
All right, so looks like we have reached this end of this question answer session, and we need to move to the next section where I will answer your queries on CE certificate, how you can download your CE certificate. So thank you so much attendees for the participation and for joining us today. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to send them at webinar@sovhealth.com. If you have any questions related to CE certificate, please send your questions at ce@sovhealth.com. I repeat, if you have any CE certificate related questions, please send in your queries at ce@sovhealth.com. And once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with all the information pertaining to this webinar and how you can download your CE certificate. This presentation will be available to watch after 48 hours on sovinstitute.com. Nicole, can you move the slide? I just want to like instruct the audience about their CE certificate. Yeah, the next one. All right.
This
So,
one right here.
yeah, this one. You need to move the slide accordingly. Okay. So now I will explain you how you can download your CE certificate. First of all, you need to go on our website called sovinstitute.com. It's www.sovinstitute.com. Now, this is the home page of the website. Here, you need to register yourself as a new user if you are signing for the first time by entering your details on the registration form. Otherwise, if you are already registered, please enter your login details in the form. By logging in, you will go to the next page where you will find lots of webinar and event presentations. Select the webinar you are interested in. Then, by selecting the webinar, you will land up on the next page where you will find the details about the webinar, where you will need to press Continue to Video button at the right-hand bottom to watch the webinar recording. However, if you have already attended the webinar, you can skip that video and go to the next page by pressing the button Continue to Quiz at the right-hand bottom. Then you will land up on the quiz section where you can answer quiz questions and download your CE certificate. And if you still have some questions regarding your CE certificate, please feel free to send them at ce@sovhealth.com. Now, thank you very much for your participation, and we hope you found this information valuable. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll look forward to bringing more interesting webinar each month. Have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Keep joining us. Thank you and goodbye.